What if I told you that right now, in the heart of Africa, there are tribes practicing ancient Jewish rituals that most people have never heard of? What if these communities have been keeping traditions alive for over 1,000 years, speaking Hebrew, celebrating Passover, and following the Torah in ways that would shock the world? But here's the crazy part. Their story has been deliberately hidden, suppressed, and even denied by governments and institutions for centuries. Why? Because it challenges everything we think we know about Jewish history and African heritage. Picture this. It's the 1980s in Ethiopia. A secret operation called Operation Moses is underway. Israeli military planes are quietly flying into Sudan under the cover of darkness. Their mission? To rescue thousands of Black African Jews who have been practicing Judaism longer than most European Jewish communities even existed. But that's just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. From the mountains of Ethiopia to the villages of Uganda, from ancient Mali to modern-day Ghana, there are Jewish communities that have stories so incredible, so mind-blowing, that they've been kept secret from the rest of the world. Today, we're diving deep into the forbidden history that textbooks won't teach you. We're talking about the Beta Israel, the Abba Yudea, the Lemba people, and communities that claim direct lineage from King Solomon himself. Some of these stories will make you question everything you thought you knew about both Jewish and African history. Stick around because what you're about to learn will completely change how you see the world. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why this history was kept hidden for so long. Let's start with the most incredible story of all, the Beta Israel of Ethiopia. These aren't recent converts or people who just decided to practice Judaism. We're talking about a community that has been Jewish for over 2,000 years, living in the mountains of Ethiopia, completely cut off from the rest of the Jewish world. Here's where it gets wild. The Beta Israel have their own version of Jewish history that's totally different from what you learned in school. They say they're descendants of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. Yeah, that Queen of Sheba from the Bible who visited Solomon with all her gold and spices? According to Ethiopian tradition, she was Ethiopian, and when she went back home, she was pregnant with Solomon's child. But wait, it gets crazier. The Beta Israel have been practicing a form of Judaism that's so old, it predates the Talmud. They follow the Torah, sure, but they also have traditions that come straight from the First Temple period. They sacrifice animals during Passover, they have their own priests called Kohanim, and they've been speaking Hebrew prayers for centuries, all while being completely isolated from other Jewish communities. For hundreds of years, nobody believed they were really Jewish. European Jews thought it was impossible. How could there be Black African Jews? It didn't fit the narrative. So they were ignored, dismissed, and forgotten. But then something amazing happened. In the 1970s, Israeli rabbis finally recognized them as one of the lost tribes of Israel. Suddenly, Israel had to deal with the fact that there were tens of thousands of Ethiopian Jews who wanted to come home to Israel. This is where the story gets really intense. Ethiopia in the 1980s was a disaster. There was civil war, famine, and the communist government was making life hell for everyone, especially the Beta Israel. These Jewish Ethiopians were facing persecution, starvation, and death. So Israel launched secret rescue operations. Operation Moses in 1984, Operation Joshua in 1985, and the most incredible one, Operation Solomon in 1991. In just 36 hours, Israeli planes rescued over 14,000 Ethiopian Jews, bringing them to Israel in the largest airlift in history. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. When these Ethiopian Jews arrived in Israel, they knew Hebrew prayers that Israeli rabbis had never heard before. They had traditions that were older than anything in modern Judaism. They were practicing a form of Judaism that was closer to the original temple worship than what most Jews do today. Yet even after being rescued, the Beta Israel faced discrimination in Israel. Some people questioned if they were really Jewish. Can you believe that? People who had been practicing Judaism for 2,000 years were being questioned by people whose families had only been Jewish for a few generations. The Beta Israel story proves something incredible. That Jewish history isn't just European history. There were Jewish kingdoms in Africa, Jewish communities that flourished while European Jews were facing persecution, and traditions that survived in Ethiopia that were lost everywhere else in the world. But the Ethiopian Jews are just the beginning. There are other African Jewish communities with stories that are even more shocking. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think about the Beta Israel story. Did you know about Operation Solomon? And what do you think about the idea that there were Jewish kingdoms in Africa that predated most European Jewish communities? Now let's talk about something that's going to mess with your head completely. Meet the Lemba people of Southern Africa. These are Bantu-speaking Africans living in Zimbabwe and South Africa, who have been claiming for centuries that they're descendants of Jews who came to Africa long before anyone else. For the longest time, everyone thought this was just folklore. African people claiming Jewish ancestry? Impossible, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. In the 1990s, scientists decided to test Lemba DNA. And what they found was absolutely incredible. The Lemba people have a higher frequency of Jewish genetic markers than most other populations in the world. We're talking about the Cohen modal haplotype, a genetic signature found in Jewish priests. The Lemba have it at rates that match Jewish populations in the Middle East. But it gets even wilder. The Lemba have oral traditions that are surprisingly accurate. They claim their ancestors came from a place called Senna. For years, people thought this was made up. Then archaeologists discovered that there really was an ancient Jewish trading post called Senna in Yemen. The details match perfectly. The Lemba have been practicing Jewish-like customs for centuries. They don't eat pork, they circumcise their boys, they have a priestly class, and they even have their own version of the Star of David. They call themselves the people who came from afar, and they've maintained these traditions despite being surrounded by different cultures for over 1,000 years. Here's what's really mind-blowing. The Lemba have this sacred object called the Ngoma Lungundu. They say it's a copy of the Ark of the Covenant. For generations, only certain people could touch it, just like the biblical Arkansas. When researchers finally got to study it, they found it was made with techniques and materials that match ancient Middle Eastern craftsmanship. But the Lemba aren't the only ones. There are Jewish communities all over Africa that have similar stories. In Ghana, there's the House of Israel community. In Uganda, there are the Abba Judea. In Nigeria, there are multiple groups claiming Jewish ancestry. And here's the crazy part. When their DNA gets tested, many of them show Middle Eastern and Jewish genetic markers. This is where things get controversial. Why haven't we heard about these communities? Why is African Jewish history so unknown? Because it challenges the narrative that Judaism is primarily a European or Middle Eastern thing. It shows that Jews spread to Africa very early, established communities, and maintained their traditions for centuries. Some of these communities claim they arrived in Africa before the destruction of the First Temple. That would make them older than most Jewish communities anywhere else in the world. Think about that for a second. While Jews in Europe were facing persecution and expulsion, there were thriving Jewish communities in Africa that nobody talks about. The Lemba story also proves something else important. Genetic testing is revealing connections that oral traditions have maintained for centuries. These aren't people making up stories to get attention. These are communities with real genetic, cultural, and historical connections to ancient Jewish populations. But here's what really gets me. Even with DNA evidence, even with historical proof, many of these communities still face skepticism. People still question whether they're really Jewish, as if being Jewish is something you can only be if you look a certain way or come from a certain place. The truth is, Judaism spread across Africa much earlier and much more extensively than most people realize. From ancient trading routes to refugee communities, from lost tribes to hidden populations, Africa has a Jewish history that's been ignored for way too long. What do you think about the Lemba people having Jewish DNA? Does it change how you think about African history? And why do you think these stories have been kept so quiet for so long? Let me know in the comments. Alright, now we're getting into some seriously mind-bending territory. What if I told you that there were entire Jewish kingdoms in medieval Africa that were more powerful and more prosperous than most European countries at the time? What if some of the richest empires in African history had significant Jewish populations that helped build their wealth and influence? Let's start with something that's going to shock you. The Empire of Mali, famous for Mansa Musa, the richest man who ever lived, had major Jewish communities. We're talking about the 1200s and 1300s when Mali controlled the gold and salt trades that made it incredibly wealthy. Jewish merchants and traders were a crucial part of this economy. But here's what's really incredible. There are historical records showing that some of the noble families in Mali claimed Jewish ancestry. There were cities in Mali where Jewish merchants had their own quarters, their own synagogues, and their own schools. These weren't just random traders passing through. These were established communities that had been there for generations. The most famous of these was a place called Timbuktu. Yeah, that Timbuktu. Everyone knows it was a center of Islamic learning, but what most people don't know is that it also had a significant Jewish population. Jewish scholars worked alongside Islamic scholars. Jewish merchants traded alongside Muslim merchants. There was this incredible cultural mixing that nobody talks about today. And get this, there are manuscripts from Timbuktu written in Hebrew. Ancient texts about Jewish law, Jewish philosophy, and Jewish history, all written in the heart of West Africa. These manuscripts prove that there were learned Jewish communities in Africa who were creating their own literature and maintaining their own traditions. But Mali wasn't the only place. In Morocco and Algeria, there were Berber tribes that converted to Judaism. These weren't isolated individuals. We're talking about entire tribes, thousands of people, who adopted Judaism and maintained it for centuries. Some historians believe these Berber Jewish tribes were incredibly powerful and controlled major trade routes across North Africa. There's this amazing story about a Berber Jewish queen named Dihya al-Kahina. She fought against the Arab invasions of North Africa in the 600 CE. She led a confederation of Berber tribes, many of whom were Jewish, and for years she held off one of the most powerful armies in the world. She's basically the African Jewish version of Braveheart, but nobody knows her story. Then there's the Kingdom of Semyon in Ethiopia. This wasn't just a community or a tribe. This was an actual Jewish kingdom that lasted for centuries. The Beta Israel weren't just scattered villages. They had their own kings, their own armies, their own territory. They controlled trade routes and had diplomatic relationships with other African kingdoms. The craziest part? Some of these Jewish African kingdoms were more tolerant and more advanced than European kingdoms at the same time. While Jews in Europe were being expelled from countries and forced to live in ghettos, African Jewish communities were running their own kingdoms, controlling international trade, and living as equals with their neighbors. But here's where the story gets dark. When European colonialism came to Africa, one of the first things colonizers did was destroy evidence of these advanced African civilizations. They couldn't allow the narrative that Africans had built sophisticated kingdoms, especially kingdoms that included Jewish populations that challenged European Jewish experiences. Documents were destroyed, oral traditions were suppressed, and entire communities were scattered. The colonial powers rewrote African history to make it seem like Africa was just tribal and primitive before Europeans arrived. The existence of Jewish African kingdoms didn't fit this narrative, so it was erased. Even today, many historians ignore or downplay these African Jewish kingdoms. It's easier to teach that Judaism spread from the Middle East to Europe and that's it. The idea that there were powerful Jewish kingdoms in Africa, that Jewish culture flourished in Africa, that African Jews might have different traditions and different stories, that's too complicated for the simple narrative that most people want to believe. But the evidence is there. Archaeological sites, genetic studies, linguistic analysis, historical documents. All of it points to the fact that Africa had extensive Jewish populations that created their own kingdoms, their own culture, and their own version of Jewish history. This isn't just about the past either. Understanding this history changes how we think about Africa today, how we think about Jewish identity, and how we think about the connections between different cultures and civilizations. What's your take on these medieval African Jewish kingdoms? Did you know that Timbuktu had Jewish scholars and Hebrew manuscripts? And why do you think this history has been so thoroughly erased from what we learn in school? Drop your thoughts below. Now we're getting to the part that's absolutely revolutionary. Modern science is proving what oral traditions have been saying for centuries, that Jewish populations spread across Africa much earlier and much more extensively than anyone imagined. And the discoveries being made right now are completely rewriting history. Let's start with the genetic bombshells. DNA testing has revealed that multiple African populations have significant Middle Eastern and Jewish ancestry. We're not talking about recent mixing. We're talking about ancient connections that go back thousands of years. The Igbo people of Nigeria are a perfect example. For generations, Igbo communities have maintained traditions that are remarkably similar to Jewish practices. They have oral histories about coming from the Middle East, they practice circumcision, they have dietary restrictions similar to kosher laws, and they have festivals that mirror Jewish holidays. When genetic testing started, people thought these similarities were just coincidence. But then the DNA results came back. Many Igbo populations show Middle Eastern ancestry that matches Jewish genetic markers. Some communities have frequencies of Jewish haplogroups that are higher than many acknowledged Jewish populations. But Nigeria isn't the only place. In Cameroon, there are communities with Jewish genetic markers. In South Africa, beyond the Lemba, there are other groups showing similar patterns. In Madagascar, there are populations with both Middle Eastern and Jewish ancestry. Across the continent, genetic testing is revealing Jewish connections that nobody expected. Here's what's really incredible. Some of these genetic signatures suggest that Jewish populations arrived in Africa much earlier than anyone thought possible. We're talking about migrations that might have happened during the First Temple period, over 2,500 years ago. That would make some African Jewish communities older than most European Jewish communities. But it's not just genetics. Archaeological discoveries are backing up these genetic findings. Researchers are finding ancient synagogues, Jewish burial sites, and Hebrew inscriptions in places where nobody expected them. In Sudan, they found evidence of ancient Jewish communities. In Kenya, there are archaeological sites with Jewish artifacts. One of the most exciting discoveries is happening right now in Ethiopia. Beyond the Beta Israel, researchers are finding evidence of other ancient Jewish communities that were previously unknown. There are cave systems with Hebrew inscriptions, ancient ritual baths, and artifacts that suggest there were multiple Jewish populations in Ethiopia, not just the ones we already knew about. The technology revolution is also helping. Satellite imagery is revealing archaeological sites across Africa that weren't visible before. Ground-penetrating radar is finding buried structures. Chemical analysis of ancient artifacts is revealing their origins. All of this technology is uncovering more evidence of ancient African Jewish communities. But here's where things get really interesting. Social media and the internet are allowing these communities to connect with each other and with the wider Jewish world in ways that were never possible before. African Jewish communities that were isolated for centuries are now able to share their stories, compare their traditions, and prove their connections. YouTube channels, Facebook groups, and websites are documenting traditions, sharing genetic test results, and building networks between African Jewish communities across the continent. This is creating a kind of African Jewish renaissance where communities are rediscovering their heritage and connecting with their roots. Some communities are even making aliyah to Israel, moving to the Jewish homeland based on their genetic and cultural connections. But this process isn't always smooth. Israeli authorities sometimes struggle with recognizing African Jewish communities, especially when their traditions are different from mainstream Judaism. This raises some huge questions about Jewish identity. If genetics prove Jewish ancestry, if oral traditions maintain Jewish practices, if archaeological evidence shows ancient Jewish communities, then what makes someone Jewish? Is it genetics? Is it practice? Is it recognition by established Jewish authorities? The modern discoveries are also challenging how we think about the African diaspora. We usually think about Africans being taken to other continents as slaves. But the genetic evidence shows that there were also significant movements of Middle Eastern and Jewish populations into Africa, often as traders, refugees, or settlers. This creates a much more complex picture of African history, one where Africa wasn't just a source of people for other continents, but also a destination for populations from the Middle East and elsewhere. And here's the biggest thing. This is just the beginning. Genetic technology is getting better and cheaper every year. Archaeological techniques are becoming more sophisticated. More communities are getting tested and sharing their results. We're likely going to discover even more African Jewish communities and even more ancient connections. The forbidden history of African Jewish tribes isn't really forbidden anymore. It's being revealed, documented, and celebrated. And it's changing how we understand both Jewish history and African history. What do you think about these modern genetic discoveries? Are you surprised by how extensive Jewish populations in Africa seem to have been? And how do you think these discoveries should change how we teach history? Let me know what you think in the comments. So there you have it, the incredible, hidden, forbidden history of Africa's Jewish tribes. From the ancient Beta Israel of Ethiopia to the genetic revelations about the Lemba people, from the Jewish kingdoms of medieval Mali to the modern DNA discoveries happening right now, this is a story that's been kept quiet for way too long. Why was this history hidden? Because it challenges too many assumptions. It shows that Jewish history isn't just European history. It proves that Africa had sophisticated civilizations and diverse populations long before colonialism. It demonstrates that identity and heritage are much more complex than simple categories. But more than that, these stories show us something beautiful about human history. They show us that cultures mixed, communities traveled, and people maintained their traditions across thousands of years and thousands of miles. They show us that the human story is much more interconnected and much more amazing than we usually realize. The Beta Israel maintaining Hebrew prayers in isolation for 2,000 years. The Lemba people preserving genetic markers and cultural traditions across centuries. Medieval African kingdoms with Jewish populations creating wealth and knowledge. Modern communities using DNA testing to rediscover ancient connections. These aren't just historical curiosities. These are profound examples of human resilience, cultural preservation, and the power of identity. If this video opened your eyes to something new, if it made you think differently about history, then I've done my job. But this is just the beginning of the conversation. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see more videos about hidden histories, forbidden stories, and the incredible discoveries that are changing how we understand our world. Ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming content about the amazing connections between cultures that textbooks don't teach you. And please share this video. These stories deserve to be known. The history of African Jewish tribes deserves to be told. The more people who know these stories, the harder it becomes to keep them hidden. Drop a comment below and tell me what shocked you the most. What story do you want to learn more about? What other hidden histories do you think we should explore? Your comments help me understand what resonates with you and what videos to make next. If you're interested in learning more, I've put links in the description to documentaries, books, and research papers about African Jewish communities. There's so much more to explore, so much more to discover. And remember, history is much more amazing, much more complex, and much more connected than most people realize. Every time we uncover a hidden story like this, we get a little closer to understanding the full incredible tapestry of human experience. Thanks for watching, thanks for learning, and thanks for helping to spread these important stories. I'll see you in the next video where we're going to dive into another piece of forbidden history that's going to blow your mind. Until then, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep discovering the amazing hidden stories of our world.